Chapter 25, Section 2 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lenny. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2 by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 25, Literature from the Death of Tiberius to Trajan, Section 2. Literature under the Flavian Emperors. All the Flavian emperors patronized literature, although none of them was so devoted to it as either Claudius or Nero. Vespasian was not unskilled, even in Greek eloquence, and he wrote memoirs. We hear of Titus writing a poem on the appearance of a comet, and Domitian was devoted to poetry in his youth. But Vespasian also actively encouraged literary talent. He was the first to endow Latin and Greek rhetoricians with a yearly allowance, 100,000 sesterces, from the fisc. He gave rich rewards to distinguished poets, and encouraged art in the same way. Domitian promoted poetical activity by the Capitoline and Alban contests. The effect of Domitian's despotism on literature may be easily exaggerated. His rule, though absolute, was not despotic until the later years of his reign, and it was only a small class of people who had anything to fear from his suspicion or jealousy. There is no question that men were not free to criticize the government or write republican tirades, which were really an attack on the imperial system, but there were many other subjects for poets or prose writers to choose if they wished. The writing of contemporary history is the only branch of literature which must necessarily suffer under such a rule as that of Domitian. Gaius Plinius Secundus, A.D. 23-79, of Comum in Cisalpine Gaul, generally called the elder Pliny to distinguish him from his nephew, was perhaps the most learned man of his time. His death, in the great eruption of Vesuvius, has already been mentioned. He had filled the office of procurator in various provinces, and had found time, amid his official activities, to pursue studies of the most varied and comprehensive character, and to write a great number of books. Besides lesser works, he wrote a history in 20 books of all the wars that Rome ever waged with the Germans, a work entitled Studiosi, being a sort of introduction to rhetoric with examples, a grammatical treatise dealing with doubtful forms in declension and conjugation, a contemporary history in 31 books, probably reaching from the fall of Gaius to the year 71 A.D., and a natural history. Pliny's nephew gives us an interesting account of the manner in which his uncle disposed of his time, so as to be able to get through an amount of literary work which another man, with all his time to himself, could hardly accomplish. Before dawn he used to attend on the Emperor Vespasian, in his capacity of Procurator Caesaris, and then proceed to the execution of his official business, which was thus finished early. On returning home he devoted the rest of his time to study. After food he read a book, making notes and extracts, for he read nothing without making extracts from it. In the bath he either dictated or listened to something read out. In travelling he always had at his side a secretary with book and notebook, whose hands in winter were protected by gloves. He deemed all time lost that was not spent on study. As he wrote so much, Pliny could attend little to the form or style of his writing, and his works are memorable rather for the quantity of matter which he put together than for the quality of the composition or the discretion of his criticism. The only one of his works which has been preserved is his Naturalis Historia, dedicated to the Emperor Titus in 77 A.D. It consisted, according to the design of the author, of 36 books, to which was prefixed a list of the contents and an account of the sources which he used. This prefatory matter was afterwards issued, probably by his nephew, as the first book, so that the work in its present form consists of 37 books. It gives an encyclopedic account of the results of natural science, and deals with physics, geography, zoology, anthropology, botany, and mineralogy. Pliny was conscious of the dryness of his work, which sometimes becomes a mere enumeration of details, and he endeavoured to enliven it by introducing occasional descriptions in the rhetoric style which was then in fashion. He introduces the different subjects of which he treats by general remarks, often in a moralizing tone, and very concisely expressed. Like Seneca and Columella, he frequently deplores the degeneracy of the age. In religion he is hostile to the popular creed, but is not a follower of any particular philosophical system. His view of the universe is pantheistic. He inclines to the belief that the sun is the spirit and mind of the world, the chief ruler and deity of nature. The most eminent historians under Vespasian were Marcus Clavius Rufus, an orator of consular rank, and Vipstanus Messala, also an orator and a friend of Tacitus in his youth. The work of Rufus embraced the reign of Nero and the events of the year of the 4 emperors. He took an unfavourable view of Seneca, whereas another historical writer of the time, Fabius Rusticus, praised Seneca's political career. Messala, who had taken part as a military tribune in the events of 69 A.D., wrote memoirs of his own experiences. Under Domitian, Vibius Maximus wrote a universal history. None of these works have survived. Of orators, M. Aper was one of the most distinguished. Of jurists, the Sabinian, Silius Sabinus, a man of great influence under Vespasian, and the Proculian, Pegasus, reported to have been an incorruptible interpreter of the laws. More eminent than Aper and the other pleaders of the day was the teacher and scientific student of rhetoric, Marcus Fabius Quintilianus, who increases the goodly roll of Spaniards distinguished in literature. Born at Caliguris about 35 A.D., he came to Rome in the train of Galba, soon gained a reputation for his eloquence, and became the glory of the Roman toga. Like his countryman Seneca, he was entrusted with the education of the imperial princes, the grandnephews of Domitian. He was the first to hold the professorial chair of rhetoric at Rome, founded by Vespasian. He was very successful as a teacher and acquired wealth. His great work, entitled Institutio Oratoria, the training of an orator, consists of 12 books, intended to be a complete guide to a man's education for a public career from childhood. He has a high ideal of the duties and rights of an orator. His treatise is not so superficial as those of Cicero on the same subject, but it is more popular than the technical handbooks on rhetoric. He has a sober, independent judgment, and remarkable insight in literary criticism. He is not blinded by great reputations or misled by the current ideas of his age. On the contrary, he is remarkable for his depreciation of Seneca's style, and for his opposition to contemporary prejudices, especially in his admiration of Cicero, whom it was the fashion to underrate as an orator, but whom he regards as a model. In his critical estimates he is more inclined to be too lenient than too severe. Quintilian recognized clearly and condemned judicially the faults of taste, the mannerisms, the affectations, the marks of decadence which characterized the literature of his own age. The inspiration of nature, the natural expression of a simple feeling, was regarded as a baseness, a defect of art. Nothing was considered worth reading, or, at least, worthy of admiration, that was not far-fetched or that did not glitter with figures and phrases. Almost all our speech is metaphor. The antique, the remote, the unexpected were the fashion of the day. Quintilian frequently uses the word lascivia, wantonness, to describe the nature of the modern style of writing. But, in spite of the protests of Quintilian and some others like him, The modern style was victorious. Men would not go back to the simple uncombed antiquity, even when, after the first impulse of reaction, they came to admire its excellences. We have already met Sixtus Julius Frontinus as conqueror of the Silures in Britain, and afterwards as assisting Domitian in establishing strategic posts beyond the Rhine. He was clearly an able man. Tacitus even describes him as a great man who would have approved himself great if he had not been hindered by the jealousy of Domitian. Here he has to be spoken of as a writer on technical subjects. 2 of his treatises have been preserved, and fragments of a third. The Strategemata consists of 3 books illustrating the artifices of strategy by examples chiefly taken from Roman history. Some later writer added a 4th book to the genuine work of Frontinus. The De Aquis Urbis Romae, composed in 97 A.D., in which year he held the post of Curator Aquarum, and published after Nerva's death, furnishes us with a most valuable account of the aqueducts of Rome, their construction and administration. Frontinus also wrote a book on field measurement, Grammatica, of which only some extracts are extant. He died about the year 103 A.D. Whenever he was not holding a public office, he lived a retired life on the Campanian coast. His modesty seems to have been equal to his merits. He forbade a monument to be erected to his memory. "The expense," he said, "is unnecessary. Our memory will endure if we have deserved it by our life." Another technical writer of Domitian's time deserves mention, the grammarian Aemilius Asper, best known for his commentary on Virgil, which seems to have been a valuable work, but unfortunately only extracts remain. Epic poetry was diligently cultivated in the Flavian age, and we possess no less than 4 heroic poems, 3 of considerable length. Gaius Valerius Flaccus began his Argonautica in the reign of Vespasian, whom he invokes in the opening verses. The composition of the work went on during the following reign, until the poet died before the year 90 A.D., leaving his poem unfinished in 8 books. The death of Medea's brother Absyrtus and the return of the Argonauts to Greece were still to be told, and it seems probable that Valerius intended the whole work to consist of 12 books, on the model of the Aeneid. Valerius made the Argonautica of the Alexandrine poet Apollonius of Rhodes the basis of his composition, but took care not to borrow the tedious erudition of the Greek. He aims more than his model at sentimental and pathetic effects, and takes pains with the psychological development of his characters. He formed his style closely on that of Virgil, whom he imitates and echoes on every page, somewhat as Persius imitated Horace, and, like Persius, he is often difficult and obscure by reason of his artificiality. In versification he is as strict as Ovid. Another epic writer under Vespasian was Salius Bassus, but none of his works are preserved. It is related that Vespasian bestowed upon him a liberal present in recognition of his poetry, and Tacitus calls him a most perfect poet. In the same reign Cariacius Maternus wrote tragedies on Roman subjects, and a Greek play on Thyestes. Titus Cassius Silius Italicus, 25 to 101 A.D., chose, after the example of Lucan, an episode of Roman history as subject of an epic poem. He chose the Second Punic War, and his work, entitled Punica, in 17 books, has come down to us. Silius went through the usual stages of an official career, which was respectable but not distinguished. He held the consulship in the year of Nero's death, and was afterwards proconsul of Asia. As a senator he was respected, but had no political influence. On the other hand, he made no enemies. After his proconsulship he retired from public life, and devoted himself to the service of the Muses. "Now," says his friend Martial, "Helicon is his forum." proque suo que lebrat nunc helicona foro. Celius suffered from an incurable tumor, and it finally became so irksome to him that he determined to put an end to his life, and starved himself to death in his villa at Naples. Silius wrote his Punica in the reign of Domitian, whom he addresses in the usual tone of courtly flattery. "Thou," he cries, "O Germanicus, wilt transcend the deeds of thy kinsmen, Vespasian and Titus," and he celebrates the emperor as a greater bard than Orpheus. The poem was judged by a contemporary writer to display greater diligence than talent, a judgment which might be extended to most of the writers of the age. To a modern reader the work is irredeemably dull. It abounds in imitations from Virgil in incident as well as in language, and is not marked by the least originality of any kind. Silius was an enthusiastic admirer of the poet of the Aeneid, used to celebrate his birthday with religious solemnity, especially when he was at Naples, and used to visit the tomb of Virgil as if it were a temple. He has by no means the same skill as his contemporary Valerius Flaccus in introducing Virgilian echoes. The Punica ends with Scipio's triumph after the battle of Zama, and, like the Aeneid, is national in sentiment. But while Virgil's national sentiment is a genuine inspiration, that of Silius is a cold and correct reflection of the Virgilian spirit. Hannibal plays the part of Turnus. Like Turnus, too, Hannibal fights with a phantom, and Juno plays the same anti-Roman part in the poem of Silius that she had played in the poem of Virgil. The usual epic paraphernalia are duly worked in: the catalogue, the Nekia, the games, the description of a shield, the dream god, the battle on a river's bank. A tendency to stoicism can be distinctly traced in the poem, but, unlike Lucan, Silius never touches upon politics. He neither reflects on the present nor regrets the past. To him the warriors of the old republic are no longer the men of the Forum and the Capitol, such as he sees before his own eyes. They have passed into the twilight of myths and demigods. To him Scipio is a second Hercules, the achiever of labors, the tamer of monsters, the umpire of the divinities of pleasure and virtue. Hannibal is an ogre or giant of romance, who seems to vanish at the catastrophe of the story in a tempest of flame and cloud. This contrast with Lucan is an instructive indication of the change in spirit which took place at Rome even in Stoic circles during the last 40 years of the first century. In the technical construction of his verses, Silius is excessively strict, like all his contemporaries. Publius Popinius Statius of Naples, 45 96 A.D., also composed epic poems in the reign of Domitian. He had inherited a taste for poetry from his father, who had celebrated in verse the burning of the Capitol in 69 A.D., and was about to compose a work on the eruption of Vesuvius when he died. The younger Statius won the olive wreath at the Alban contest in poetry, instituted by that emperor 3 times, but he was defeated in the Capitoline competition. His circumstances were comfortable, and he possessed a country place at Alba, which was perhaps a gift of the emperor. He enjoyed the patronage of a nobleman named Metius Celer. At the beginning of Domitian's reign he composed a mime, entitled Agawe. He promised, and perhaps began to write, an epic celebrating the German expedition of the emperor, but, if begun, it was never finished. 3 works of Statius have been preserved, of which the longest and most ambitious is the Thebaid, which occupied him for 12 years. The subject of the poem is the war between Eteocles and Polynices, the sons of Oedipus, and it is treated very unequally. The first 10 books are devoted to the preparations, and are lengthened out with digressions and prolix speeches, while all the important events, to which these preparations lead up, including the combat of the brothers and the story of Antigone, are compressed in the last 2 books. Books 5 and 6 are occupied with the episode of Hypsipyle and Archimerus. This want of artistic proportion is to some extent compensated for by careful finish in the detail, but there is little psychological skill in portraying the characters and little poetical imagination. Like Valerius and Silius, he regards Virgil as the epic mode. It is probable that he drew his material from the Thebaid from the Greek poet Antimachus. Of another epic poem, dealing with the life of Achilles, only a small part was written, and this has come down to us. The first book of the Aeschylade tells how Thetis hid her son among the daughters of Lycomedes at Cyrrhus, how the distinguished hero made love to Deidamia and was discovered by Ulysses. Of the second book only a short fragment remains. The style is less crabbed than in the Thebaid. The Silvae is a collection of occasional poems arranged in 5 books, and is the most interesting of the works of Statius. Each poem was composed separately, and a number, from 5 to 9, afterwards collected in a book, which was published with a prose preface. The greater number of these pieces are in hexameter meter, but some are in hendecasyllabic, alcaic, and Sapphic meters. They were almost all written in the last 6 years of Domitian's reign. The first book is dedicated to the poet Stella, and one of the poems included in it is an epithalamium on the occasion of the marriage between Stella and Violentilla. Deaths and births, the handsome villas, the rich baths, or the beautiful statues belonging to wealthy friends, form the subjects of other pieces. There is a lament composed on the death of the poet's father, and an eclogue, really a sort of familiar epistle, to his wife Claudia. One poem celebrates the birthday of the poet Lucan, whom he extols with enthusiasm, and the circumstance that he praises Cato and speaks sympathetically of the spirit of Lucan's poem shows that Domitian's censorship of the press cannot have been as severe as it is sometimes made out to be. Statius, however, regarded Lucan entirely from a literary point of view. He was a court poet, and was ready to purchase the favour of Domitian by adulation, both of the emperor himself and of his favourites. In celebrating the occasion of Domitian's 17th consulship, he adopted a tone of hyperbolic flattery. He composed a special poem to thank the emperor for an invitation to dine at the imperial table. He wrote lines on the locks of the boy Irinus, a favourite of Domitian. In the poems of Statius we observe a tendency to epigrammatic writing and an anxious care in the coinage of phrases. Skill in epigram is indeed the characteristic of the age, and Martial is the characteristic poet. The verses of Martial, it has been said, are the quintessence of the Flavian poetry. Marcus Valerius Martialis, about 40 to 102 A.D., was born at Bilbilis in Spain, and thus makes the 4th Spaniard of the 1st century who holds a very distinguished place in literature. He lived for 34 years in Rome, and returned to his native country at the end of his life, 98 A.D. He was poor, and seems to have had no fixed employment. He possessed a small house in Rome, and a small country place at Nomentum, in the Sabine territory. Both Titus and Domitian conferred upon him, in recognition of his poems, the privileges which the law gave to those who were the fathers of 3 children, ius trium liberorum, and he was made a military tribune, which gave him the standing of a knight. His flattery to Domitian is even more extravagant than that of Statius. He was a more needy and more eager bidder for court favour. Among his patrons were Irinus, Crispinus, and Parthenius. As an example of his glorification of the emperor may be quoted the verses in which he cries: "Under what leader was martial Rome fairer and greater? Under what princeps did we enjoy such great liberty?" Martial can be convicted of being a time-server out of his own mouth, for, after the death of Domitian, he confesses that "the reign of terror is over." It is conceivable, however, that here too he spoke less from conviction than from a desire to be agreeable to the new government. His epigrams were collected in 14 books, of which each contains about 100 epigrams. Most of the books are introduced by a preface, either in prose, like the Silvae of Statius, or in verse. The 13th and 14th books, entitled respectively Xenia and Apoporeta, consist altogether of distichs on presents suitable for the Saturnalian festival, epigrams in the original sense of the word. The other books contain epigrams in the later sense of the word, short and often with a fine point. Besides these, there is an unnumbered book, known as the Liber Spectaculorum, consisting of poems which refer to the public spectacles at Rome. In the art of epigram, Martial regarded Catullus and Domitius Marsus as his models. A large number of his verses turn on filthy subjects, but he is careful to tell us that, if his page is wanton, his life is honest. Lasciva est nobis pagina, vita proba est. He was, however, a man of no character. He prostituted his muse to the taste of the Punles. But he was a writer of the greatest talent, and his best verses are very good indeed. His works give a most valuable picture of the Roman life of his time, especially perhaps its shady sides, and we meet many notable literary persons in his pages, such as the younger Pliny, Silius, and Stella. It is remarkable that he does not mention either Statius or Tacitus. In his stinging epigrams he always used fictitious names, such as Ponticus, Tuca, Tongilianus. He mentions living persons by their true names only when he praises or says something indifferent. Auruntius Stella of Patavium, the friend of Statius and Martial, composed love poems, which were inspired by Violentilla, who afterwards became his wife. He celebrated her under the fictitious name of Asterius, but in the pages of Martial she appears as Ianthus, a Greek rendering of her true name. The death of her pet dove is the subject of one of Martial's epigrams. Another writer of erotic poems was Sulpicia, the wife of Calenus. Her verses were remarkable for their wantonness. Turnus, a distinguished satiric poet, also deserves mention. Many other verse writers in various styles, whose works have perished, are mentioned by Martial, Statius, and Pliny, but they are now nothing more than names. End of chapter 25, section 2. Section 3 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leni. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 25, Literature from the Death of Tiberius to Trajan, Section 3. Literature under Trajan. After the death of Domitian, there was, according to contemporary writers, a revival of literature. This revival has probably been exaggerated, but it is certain that history, at least, and oratory regained their freedom. Nerva would doubtless have been a patron of men of letters, but his reign was too short to affect literature. Trajan was not a man of culture, and did little directly to further learning, but he was certainly not against it. He showed special favor to the Greek rhetorician Dion Chrysostom, and he wrote himself memories of the Dacian war. His answers to Pliny's letters are brief and to the point. The private recitations of literary compositions, which had been a marked feature in the reign of Domitian, are now less conspicuous. This may be partly due to the greater liberty which orators enjoyed under Trajan. Decimus Junius Juvenalis was born at Aquinum, probably about 55 A.D. He busied himself in his youth with rhetorical studies, and served in the army. In the year 81 A.D. he served under Agricola in Britain, as the tribune or prefect of a Dalmatian cohort. He lived far into the reign of Hadrian, by whom he seems to have been banished to Egypt in the year 135 A.D., at the age of 80. But the question of the banishment is very difficult. There is some evidence for supposing that the populace declaimed certain offensive verses of Juvenal in the theatre in the emperor's presence, and that Hadrian, unable to punish the people, punished the innocent poet. Juvenal's 16 satires were published in 5 books at different times, like the Sylvae of Statius. The exact date at which they appeared are not certain. He states that indignation at crime and folly drove him to write satire. Si natura negat, facit indignatio versum. And he paints in vivid and dark colors, often with revolting realism, the social vices of his age. The persons whom he introduces have either fictitious names or belong to the past, especially to the reigns of Nero and Domitian. His verses are forcible and pointed, and the standard of morality which he sets up has been so much admired in modern times that some churchmen have thought that he must have owed something to the inspiration of Christianity. But his morality was really the stock virtue of the rhetorical schools, well and eloquently expressed. We cannot take too seriously the declamatory invectives and biting epigrams which he launches against his contemporaries. He was not concerned to give a true picture of his times. He wrote his satires at once to make an effect and gratify his spleen. Their value for us lies in the accessory parts of the pictures. They enable us to realize more vividly than we could otherwise do life and manners at Rome under Domitian, Trajan, and Hadrian. The first satire gives a general description of the follies and vices of the day, and forms a general introduction to the satires. The poet defines his subject as the whole of human life, men's passions, pleasures, and business. Quidquid agunt homines votum timor ira voluptas gaudia discursus nostri farago libelli est. It may be dangerous to attack the living, but he may at all events show up the sins of the dead, whose ashes are interred on the Flaminian and Latin ways. Experiar quid concedatur in illos, quorum Flaminia tegitur cinis atque Latina. The second deals with gross vices practised by hypocritical philosophers and hidden under a cloak of austerity. The third with the dangers and vexations of life in Rome. The fourth contains the travesty of Domitian's concilium, of which a brief account has been given in a previous chapter. The fifth describes the wretched life of a parasite, and the rebuffs and scorn which he endures for the sake of a poor dinner. The sixth, which is the most powerful of all, paints in heightened colours the fashions, follies, and vices of contemporary women. The seventh portrays the struggles and poverty of men of letters. The eighth holds up to ridicule pride in long pedigrees. It were better to be the son of Thersites and able to wield the arms of Achilles than to have Achilles for sire and be a Thersites oneself. Malo pater tibi sit Thersites, dumodo tu sis aiacidae similis vulcaniaque arma capeças, quam te Thersitae similem producat Achilles. The ninth treats of vices common in the time of Juvenal. The theme of the 10th is the vanity of human wishes. It is shown that what seems to be best is often worst, and that men know not what is really best for them. They are often ruined if the gods take them at their word. Euertere domos totas optantibus ipsis dii faciles, nocitura toga, nocitura petuntur militia. The 11th, in the form of an invitation to a friend to a simple dinner, holds up to ridicule the prevalent luxury at table. The 12th celebrates the safe return of a friend from a voyage, and describes the perils of the ocean. It also satirizes fortune hunters, captatores, who pay court to the rich and childless. The 13th, a consolation to a certain Calvinus, who had been cheated of 10 sestertia, 80 pounds, is full of Stoic doctrines epigrammatically expressed. Calvinus is admonished that such crimes are the order of the day. Perjury is general, and it would be absurd to raise an outcry for such a trifle. Besides, only small minds desire revenge. It is a feminine weakness. Quipe minuti semper et infirmi est animi exiguique voluptas ultio. Continuos si collige quod vindicta nemo magis gaudet quam femina. Calvinus is bidden to leave his false friend to his own devices, for he is not likely to stop at the first crime, and will probably sooner or later come to a bad end. The 14th enlarges on the theme that children learn vice, and especially avarice, from the example of their parents. The 15th describes a quarrel between Ombi, cum Ombu, and Tentera, Dendera, in Upper Egypt, at a religious feast held by the Ombites and interrupted by the Tenterites. The latter were put to flight, and one of them was caught and devoured by the Ombites. The 16th sketches the advantages of a soldier's life. The 7th satire is interesting and important for literary history, and deserves special notice in this place. The bulk of it seems to have been written under Trajan, but the introduction to have been added in the reign of Hadrian, under whose auspices poetry and other studies are described as reviving. Et spes et ratio studiorum in Caesare tantum. Hitherto, men of letters have been forced, in order to support life, to engage in the meanest pursuits. The poets have had no Mecenas to patronize them. The most a rich man who pretends to have a taste for poetry will do is to lend a dusty and inconvenient room for the poet to give a recitation, and send his freedmen to applaud. The best poets, like Statius, had to write verses to order for the stage, in order to get a living. The historians are worse off than the poets. Their task is more laborious, and they get less. Who will give an historian as much as one would give to the actuarius who reads aloud the daily chronicle? Quis dabit historico quantum daret acta legenti? The rhetoricians were miserably paid too. The profession of a music master was far more lucrative. Rich Quintilian was quite an exception. The fact that so little encouragement was given to poetry by Trajan may have been partly the cause why there was no distinguished poets in his reign, with the exception of Juvenal himself. There were a few of less note, and known to us only by name. Caninius, who set himself to the task of an epic on the Dacian war of Trajan, and Pasenus Paulus, who wrote elegies figuratively in the house of Propertius, may be mentioned. The most striking literary figure of Trajan's Principate, and one of the greatest historians of the world, was Cornelius Tacitus. In a history of the early empire, he and his works claim special attention, because his writings, so far as they have been preserved to us, are our chief authority. We have to thank him for most of the details which we know about the reigns of Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero, and about the civil wars which followed Nero's death. If his works had been entirely preserved, he would have been our main guide from the death of Augustus to the death of Domitian. It is because large portions of his writings have been lost that we are so ill informed about the history of Caligula and that of the Flavian emperors. Of the life of Tacitus we know little. He was born about 54 A.D., and in his early years studied jurisprudence and rhetoric. He went through the ordinary senatorial career, beginning as a military tribune under Vespasian, becoming quaestor under Titus, aedile or tribune, and then praetor in 88 A.D. under Domitian. While praetor, he was also one of the quindecimviri to whom the care of the Sibylline books was entrusted. We have already seen that he married a daughter of Agricola. After the return of Agricola to Rome, Tacitus, probably in the year 90, obtained a post in the provinces, either as legatus of a legion in Lower Germany, or as governor of Belgica, and was absent from Rome for 4 years, during which his father-in-law died. Under Nerva, in 98 A.D., he was promoted to the consulship. Of the rest of his life we only know that he was occupied with his great historical works. It seems possible that his death took place in the first years of Hadrian. The works of Tacitus which have come down to us, wholly or partially, are 5 in number. 1. His earliest work, a consequence of his rhetorical studies, was the Dialogus de Oratoribus, which perhaps appeared soon after 80 A.D. The dialogue is supposed to have taken place in the 6th year of Vespasian, 75 A.D., and the speakers are the most celebrated rhetoricians and men of letters of that time, including Curiatus Maternus, Vipstanus Messala, Aper, and Julius Secundus. The object of the work is to trace and explain the decline of oratory under the Empire. The causes which he assigns are both political and social, and in the earliest work the republican sympathies and anti-imperial bias of the author can be seen plainly. It also exhibits the same psychological acuteness and the same skill in saying sharp things which are distinguishing marks of his historical works. In point of style, he is under the influence of Cicero. 2. The next composition of Tacitus, the life and character of Julius Agricola, his father-in-law, has been already noticed in connection with Agricola's work in Britain. It was written at the beginning of Trajan's reign. The influence of Sallust is conspicuous, and the very form of the work, as a historical monograph, resembles the Catiline and Jugurtha. The same influence is also evident in 3. The Germania, which appeared in the same year and of which some account has already been given. It was a result of the researches which the author had been making for some years back with a view to a large historical work, but which he now published in a separate form à propos of the work of Trajan on the Rhine. In describing the manners and institutions of German communities, Tacitus cannot resist pointing comparisons between the simplicity of the barbarians and the corruption of Roman civilization. He remarks, for example, that good manners are of more avail there than good laws elsewhere, and that there no man laughs at vices. But it is absurd to suppose, as some have done, that the book was written merely as a hit at Rome. 4. The Historiae, consisting of about 12 or 14 books, was written under Trajan, and embraced the period from the elevation of Galba to the death of Domitian. Unluckily, only the first 4 books and part of the 5th have come down. These are taken up with the events of 69 and 70 A.D. Owing to the loss of the later books, our knowledge of the reign of the Flavian emperors is very fragmentary, and this loss is especially to be regretted, as the author was a contemporary of the events about which he wrote. The Annals, entitled From the Death of the Divine Augustus, was likewise written under Trajan, and was published between 115 and 117 A.D. It embraced the period between Augustus and Galba, 14 to 68 A.D., and, as the material is arranged chronologically, all the various events of each year being, with few exceptions, grouped together, the work is designated by the author himself as Annales. The first 6 books, which contain the reign of Tiberius, are extant, with the exception of the greater part of Book 5. The next books, 7 to 10, and a portion of 11, which comprise the reign of Gaius and the first year of Claudius, are lost. Books 12 to 15 and a part of 16, bringing us down to the year 66 A.D., are preserved, but the end is lost, and it is not certain of how many books the work originally consisted. Tacitus had made further plans for historical work, but they were not carried out. He intended, if he had lived, to lead up to his Annals by a work on the Principate of Augustus, and also, at the other extremity, to continue his Histories by a work on the Principates of Nerva and Trajan. If these designs had been executed, he would have covered the whole imperial period down to the death of Trajan. The political sympathies of Tacitus penetrate his whole work, and while they give it much of its literary flavor, they also diminish its historical value. He was an aristocrat in his views, sympathized with the Senate of the Republic, and disliked the imperial constitution. Although his common sense obliged him to confess that the empire was a necessity, it was a necessity against which his heart revolted, and which the events which he saw with his own eyes in the last years of Domitian rendered still more odious to him. It was a calamity, he thought, due to the anger of the gods against the Roman state. His historical works are written to arraign the empire, and he sees everything in the worst light, even if he does not intend to misrepresent. We have already seen how he sets up Germanicus as a foil to Tiberius, and Corbulo as a foil to Nero. The aggressions of the emperors on the functions of the Senate are crimes in his eyes, and he regards the Roman world as in a state of servitude. Yet, on the other hand, he despised the vain talk about liberty by which such men as Helvidius Priscus courted martyrdom, and he laid down the principle that, seeing monarchy to be a necessity, we should pray for good emperors and put up with whatever kind we get. Connected with his prejudice in favour of the Senate is his prejudice in favour of Rome and Italy. He tolerates the provinces, but takes no interest in them, and has not the slightest conception that their needs justify the empire. In estimating the work of an emperor, the character of his provincial administration would have small weight with Tacitus, who thinks far more of a disturbance in Rome than of distant events affecting a whole country. With these narrow and old-fashioned views, he was unable to see the true significance of the empire, on which he pondered so much, and on which he has made many acute observations. His lack of interest in provincial matters affects his history in another way which is much more irritating. It makes him indifferent to geographical details, and thus it is often hopeless to follow on the map his vague descriptions of warfare in Britain, Germany, Armenia, or Thrace. Like Livy, he cared little for historical research, and was far more concerned with the form than with the matter of his work. The military parts of his history are generally judged to be untrustworthy. Yet, in spite of these faults, Tacitus is always regarded as one of the greatest historians. This is mainly due to his excellence as an artist in style. He wrote for effect, and he was ready to sacrifice facts to art. His picture of Tiberius is a great literary achievement, but at the expense of historical truth. His work abounds in telling epigrams and in acute and cynical observations which show great psychological insight. Many of his phrases have become familiar quotations, such as omne ignotum promirifico, maior ex longinquo reverentia. His style is concise, but always dignified and cold, never passionate or declamatory. His points of contact with his contemporaries should be observed. In bitterness, in his view of the degeneracy of society, in writing for effect, he resembles Juvenal, while in his taste for pointed epigram he shows that he belongs to the same age as the court poet Martial. Pliny the Younger belonged originally to the family of the Cecilii, which was settled at Como, in Transpadane, Italy. His father was Lucius Cecilius Silo, and his own name before adoption was probably Plinius Cecilius Secundus. He was 18 years old at the time of the eruption of Vesuvius, 79 A.D., so that he must have been born about 61 A.D. During his boyhood there was no school at Como, but he was taught well and wrote a Greek tragedy at the age of 14. On his father's death he was placed under the guardianship of Virginius Rufus, and was presently sent to Rome to finish his education, where he attended the lectures of Quintilian in rhetoric. But it was the young man's uncle on the mother's side, Gaius Plinius Secundus, whom we have already met, who exercised most influence on his studies and his future career. He and his mother were staying with his uncle at Misenum when the fatal eruption of Vesuvius took place, which caused his uncle's death. The young Cecilius was adopted by his uncle's will into the Plinian family, and henceforward his name was Gaius Plinius Cecilius Secundus. A year later Pliny pleaded his first cause before the court of the Centumviri in the Basilica Julia. Soon after this he was appointed one of the Decemviris litibus iudicandis, who, by a regulation of Augustus, presided over the centumviral court, under the general control of a praetor. He next became a military tribune of the Legion III Gallica, which was stationed in Syria, 82-83 A.D. On returning to Rome, he was appointed a Sewir of the Roman Knights, and held this office until he became quaestor, probably in 83 A.D. His next step was the tribunate of the plebs, 10th of December 91 A.D., and he was promoted to be praetor in 93 A.D., the emperor having dispensed him from the interval fixed by the lex annalis. In this rapid advancement in the senatorial career, Pliny was supported by his former guardian, Virginius Rufus. About this time he successfully aided in the prosecution of a proconsul of Baetica, but this action seems to have injured him in the favour of Domitian. The death of the tyrant was a relief to him. He had been already appointed prefect of the aerarium militare. Nerva promoted him to be prefect of the aerarium Saturni likewise. These duties so much engrossed his time that he renounced pleading in the courts, and it was with much difficulty that he was persuaded, in 100 A.D., to plead the cause of the provincials of Africa against the extortionate proconsul Marius Priscus. The accusers were successful. Marius was condemned. In the same year, Pliny was advanced by Trajan to the consulship, which he held in September and October. It devolved upon him to thank the emperor on the first day of this office, and he did so in a panegyric which has been preserved, and which, though not interesting from a literary point of view, is of great historical value, as it gives an account of the acts of Trajan in the first years of his reign. In the following year Pliny was again induced to act as the advocate of provincials against an oppressive governor. He undertook the cause of Baetica against Classicus. Some time after this he received the honour of an augurship. He had given up his treasury appointment and returned to his occupation as a pleader. He was also appointed curator aue Tiberis et riparum et cloacarum urbis. Two important cases occurred in 104 and 106 A.D. in connection with Bithynia, and were successfully conducted by Pliny. This led to his appointment, in 111 A.D. probably, as a special legatus in that province, as we have already seen. The date of his death is unknown, but was probably before 115 A.D. He was married 3 times, but had no children. Trajan granted him, however, the jus trium liberorum. The career of Pliny is interesting, as it illustrates how citizens belonging to an Italian or provincial municipium rose to the highest offices in the state. His letters are interesting as illustrating the life, opinions, and feelings of an enlightened and generous Roman gentleman. But he was neither a great writer nor a great statesman. He could discharge meritoriously the ordinary duties of a senator. He was an ardent reader, a careful and pleasant writer, but had no ideas. He was rich and liberal. We find him giving pecuniary help to Quintilian and Martial. He remedied the want of a school at Comum by paying 1/3 of the salary of a teacher. He also gave his native town a public library at the cost of 1,000,000 sesterces, £8,000, and granted 500,000 more for the maintenance of poor children. His letters prove that he was a warm friend, a loving husband, a kind master to his slaves, and that he always honestly wished to do the right thing. The letters of Pliny consist of 1. 9 books of letters, dating from 97 to 109 A.D., and 2. The correspondence with Trajan, chiefly from the Bithynian period, of which specimens were given in the preceding chapter. They concern all sorts of subjects, and show the character of the author and his relations with his friends in the most favourable light. He is very vain, but then he is very candid. The letters were written with a view to publication, and therefore they have not the freshness and directness of the letters of Cicero, who was Pliny's model, as he tells us himself. He owns that his great desire is to be remembered by posterity. There is consequently a great deal of self-consciousness in the epistles. Tacitus and Pliny were intimate friends. In one of his letters Pliny tells a story, how at the Circensian games Tacitus sat next an unknown person, who entered into learned conversation with him, and after some time asked, "Are you an Italian or a provincial?" "You know me," said Tacitus, "from your reading." "Are you Tacitus or Pliny?" asked the stranger. Besides the panegyric of Pliny, which is a specimen of the style of rhetoric then in fashion, we have a fragment of a dialogue on the theme, "Was Virgil an orator or a poet?" Virgilius Orator an Poeta, by P. Annius Flores. An African by birth, he had competed under Domitian at the Capitoline Agon, and, unfairly according to himself, had not been crowned. Leaving Rome, he travelled about and finally settled as a man of letters at Tarraco, where he lived under Trajan. At a later time he returned to Rome and interchanged light verses with the Emperor Hadrian. For he was also a verse writer, and some small fragments of verse under the name of Flores have come down. The work of Hyginus on the jurisprudence of field measurement, of which fragment have come down to us, the treatise of Siculus Flaccus de conditionibus agrorum, the works on orthography of Caper and Villius Longus, which belong to this period, can only be mentioned. End of chapter 25, section 3. Chapter 25, section 4, of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lenny. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 25, Literature from the Death of Tiberius to Trajan. Section 4. Greek Literature. The growing importance of the Jews in the Hellenic world is illustrated by the circumstances that two of the most important Greek writers of the 1st century A.D., whose work have come down to us, belonged to the Hebrew race. These were the historian Josephus and the philosopher Philo. We have already met Flavius Josephus in the tale of the Jewish rebellion under Nero and Vespasian. Born about 37 A.D., he belonged to a distinguished sacerdotal family, and on the mother's side to the royal house of the Maccabees. In religion he inclined to the sect of the Pharisees. He first visited Rome in 63 A.D. to defend some of his countrymen, and succeeded in his object through the influence of Poppaea. The part which he played in the last struggle of the Jews for independence has been already told. Received into favor by Vespasian, he lived henceforward at Rome and wrote his historical works there. His purpose in writing was to make the Greeks acquainted with the history and character of his own people. The best known and most interesting of his writings is the Story of the Jewish War, in 7 books, which has all the value of a contemporary witness who had taken part in it himself and been present at the most striking scenes, and a witness who, although a Jew, was able to see the Roman as well as the Jewish side of the question. He wrote this work in Hebrew, and then got it translated into Greek. His Jewish Archaeology, in 20 books, reaching from the creation to Nero, is a much larger work. The later books are very valuable for the history of the first Roman emperors, and in Book 18 occurs the earliest notice in literature of the founder of Christianity. Josephus also wrote his own autobiography, Life of Flavius Josephus, and 2 books against Appian, an Alexandrian grammarian who, on occasion of the Jewish embassy to Caligula, had attacked the Jews, and a treatise on the sovereignty of reason. Like Josephus, Philo of Alexandria also appears in political as well as in literary history. We met him as one of that embassy of Alexandrian Jews which waited on the Emperor Gaius in 39 A.D., and of which he wrote an account. As a philosopher, he was one of the earliest who attempted to combine Greek and Jewish ideas into a philosophical system. On the one hand, he makes Moses speak with the lips of Socrates; on the other, he derives the views of Plato, Heraclitus, and other Greek philosophers from Mosaic sources. He interprets the Old Testament allegorically, but his chief inspiration is drawn from Plato. In his treatment of Plato, in whose writings he finds more than Plato ever dreamed of, he is a precursor of the Neoplatonists. Plutarch was born at Chaeronea about 46 A.D. and educated at the University of Athens. Under Vespasian he visited Rome as an envoy from his native place, and seems to have won some influence at the imperial court. Trajan granted him consular rank, and directed the governor of Achaia to avail himself of his counsels. But the favor which he enjoyed at Rome did not induce him to quit his home, where he lived a happy domestic life and died at an advanced age. His attachment to Boeotia was a feature of his character. Hesiod and Pindar, as the two great Boeotian poets, had always a special charm for him. He seems to have occupied himself with informal teaching and lecturing, as well as with writing his historical and philosophical works. His historical work consists of the Parallel Lives, a series of 46 biographies of great Greek and Roman statesmen, grouped in pairs. In every case, except in that of the Gracchi, a Greek is compared with a Roman. This way of setting Greek and Roman history side by side was natural enough in a Greek under the Empire, recognizing the greatness of his conquerors, as well as that of his own nation. The example of such parallels had been set by Cornelius Nepos. In some cases, such as Demosthenes and Cicero, Alexander and Caesar, the comparisons are obvious; in others, such as Pyrrhus and Marius, less striking. In most cases Plutarch appends to the pair of lives a formal statement of the points of likeness and contrast. Besides these parallel lives, there are 4 single biographies of Artaxerxes, Aretas, Galba, and Otho. In compiling this historical gallery, Plutarch thought far less of finding out and relating what actually occurred than of edifying his readers and promoting virtue. He has no idea of historical criticism; he is much more at home in ethical disquisition. He loved anecdotes which point a moral. The consequence is that perhaps no ancient history has been more popular down to the present day than his Lives. His other works consist of numerous essays and treatises on various subjects, chiefly ethical, and generally grouped together under the title of Moralia. Among them may be mentioned the Platonic Questions, controversial pamphlets against the Stoics and the Epicureans, and against superstition; an attempt to explain the myth of Isis and Osiris; a large number of sermons on moral subjects, such as Virtue is Teachable, Fortune, Cheerfulness; a physical treatise on the face in the moon; a discussion of the question, Should an old man take part in public life? Literary questions are considered in The Malice of Herodotus and A Comparison of Aristophanes and Menander. His dialogue on music is very important for the history of ancient music and meter. Perhaps the most attractive of all Plutarch's works is the Symposiaca, in 9 books, containing discussions on all sorts of subjects in the form of table talk. The scene constantly changes. The symposia are sometimes at Athens, sometimes at Rome, sometimes at the author's house. As examples of the questions discussed may be mentioned the number of the Muses, the grafting of trees, the most suitable form of entertainment at table, the abstinence of Jews from pork. Another Greek essayist, contemporary with Plutarch, was Dion of Prusa in Bithynia, surnamed Chrysostomus, gold-mouthed, from his eloquence. He had come to Rome under Vespasian, but fell under suspicion with Domitian, and, banished from Italy, retired to the north shore of the Black Sea. Of the old-fashioned life at Olbia on the Borysthenes, of the enthusiasm for Homer which prevailed in that remote Greek colony, and of the dangers which constantly threatened Greek civilization in those regions from the Scythians, he has given an interesting account in his Borysthenic Discourse. Under Nerva he was recalled to Rome, and when he afterwards returned to his native town Prusa, he obtained some privileges for it by his influence with Trajan. Although Dion is counted among the Sophists, and went about as a rhetorician, it must be said to his honor that he was by no means a typical specimen. He did not, like the ordinary sophist, sacrifice thought to expression. He was a deeper thinker, inclined to stoicism, than most of his class, and he sometimes makes a hit at the vapid sophistic style. Of his discourses or essays, 79 are extant, and many of them are most interesting. In the Alexandrina he inveighs against the extravagant luxury of life in Alexandria. In the Olympica he places in the mouth of Phidias a description and explanation of that sculptor's great statue of Zeus at Olympia. In his 4 discourses on monarchy he sketches, for the benefit of Trajan, the rule of an ideal sovereign. One of the most pleasing essays is the Euboica, in which an idyllic description is given of the life of 2 rustic families in a desolate part of Euboea, and a counterpicture is drawn of life in the town. Dion aimed at writing pure Attic. His chief models were Plato and Xenophon. End of chapter 25, section 4.
Section 1 and 2 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Caron. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 26. The Principate of Hadrian, Section 1 and 2. Section 1. The accession of Hadrian, and the character of his reign. Notwithstanding his advanced age, Trajan had gone forth on his great eastern expedition, without having taken the precaution of settling the succession to the Principate by adopting a son. He had indeed made it clear enough by various marks of favor that he designed P. Milus Hadrianus, his relative, to be his successor, perhaps confident that he had still many years to live. He wished to postpone as long as possible the act of adoption, did not care for the notion of delegating to another any portion of the supreme power, or perhaps he may have thought that even without the usual measure of adoption, the succession of Hadrian was sufficiently assured, and may have been willing to leave the Senate to elect as princeps, without any apparent constraint, one who is not the son of an Augustus or a Caesar. There is certainly little reason to suppose that he had not himself decided on his successor, and that he looked forward to testing the merits of possible candidates. In the Parthian expedition he had already shown such favor to Hadrian that to have preferred another would have inevitably led to civil war, and Trajan could not have failed to foresee the result. In any case, he found himself in the presence of death before he had formally declared his will on this important question. Plotina, who was a warm supporter of Hadrian's interests, seemed to have induced the dying emperor to sign at the last moment a letter of adoption, or at least signify his consent. Was a fiction contrived by Plotina. Whether genuine or not, the letter reached Hadrian at Antioch on August 9th, 2 days before the news of Trajan's death arrived, and there can be little doubt that it represented Trajan's real wishes. The family seat of Hadrian belonged originally to Hadria, a municipality of Picenum, but had settled in the Roman colony of Italioa. His father, Hadrianus Afer, was a first cousin of Trajan. He entered early Uxum, the usual official career, and after the Vigintivirate became a legionary tribune. Under Trajan he was promoted to be quaestor 101 A.D. and tribune of the people 105 A.D. While he impressed, Plotina showed marked favor to him, and through her influence was permitted to contract a marriage with Julia Sabina, the granddaughter of Marciana, Trajan's sister, as Trajan had no children. This alliance was naturally to be significant. In the Second Dacian War Hadrian commanded a legion, and in recognition of his services the emperor presented him with a diamond ring, which he had himself received from Nerva. He became praetor in due course of time, and in 108 A.D. was elected as a suffect consul About the same time he was appointed to legatus of Lower Pannonia. After the death of Licinius Sura, his influence with Trajan doubtless increased. He took part in the eastern expedition, and in 117 A.D. was appointed to legatus of Syria, with an extraordinary military command during the emperor's absence, and in the same year was a second time consul. On receiving the news of Trajan's death, Hadrian was proclaimed imperator by the soldiers, having secured their allegiance by promising them a donative of double the usual amount. He then wrote a modest letter to the Senate, asking, as the adopted son of Trajan, for their recognition, and excusing the unconstitutional action of the soldiers, in acknowledging him as emperor before he had been elected by the Senate. Although there were many members of the Senate adverse to Hadrian, no opposition was organized against his claim. His respectful letter produced a favorable impression, and the various powers which belonged to the Princeps were duly conferred on him. Hadrian had received as a boy an education in Greek letters, perhaps at Athens, and he showed such a decided leaning to Greek life and thought that he was jestingly called the Greekling. But his interest in things not Roman went further than Greece. He was attracted by the antiquities, the mysteries, and the romance of the East, and studied Oriental philosophies and religions with curiosity. He was, in fact, a cosmopolitan, and liked to place himself in touch with all the various races and creeds and institutions which had been gathered together in the complex of the Roman Empire. He was eminently susceptible of new ideas, and must have been impatient of the narrow prejudices of the aristocracy of home. It may be readily imagined that such a man could not win the sympathy of the Senate, and though the nobles had to cloak their feelings during his lifetime, their antipathy expressed itself after his death in detraction and calumny. The note of his character was a certain restless curiosity. He desired to see all that was to be seen, to know all that was to be known, to do all that was to be done. He visited all the provinces of the empire, and in each province he was as much a sightseer as an administrator. He wrote poetry, attempted painting, acquainted himself with all the systems of philosophy. It accorded with his character that he had an extravagant passion for the excitement of the chase. The personality of this searcher out of all curiosities is indicated in his countenance, as we see it in his numerous busts. The head is bent a little, as if to catch every sound. The eyes and mouth suggest the quickness and liveliness of an intellect determined that nothing shall escape it. The type of face is neither Roman nor yet Greek. In the gallery of imperial busts, his is the first marked by a beard. Whether he wore it, as some said, to disguise a scar, or whether it was characteristic of the Greekling, it may be regarded as an outward sign of a new type of emperor. Hadrian had his faults and foibles, although he took wide views as a statesman and a thinker. He was not above petty ambitions. Although he was eminently tolerant, he was not superior to feeling jealousy at the merits of men who followed as their special calling pursuits in which he engaged as a dilettante. He was suspicious and distrustful of those who surrounded him, and naturally was not able to awaken their confidence or engage their affection. The rhetorician Fronto says that he regarded Hadrian rather as a god to be propitiated than as a man to be loved. Hadrian was a statesman of great ability, but by no means of transcendent genius. Indeed, at this time there was little scope for a man of genius. What makes him so remarkable, aid his reign so unique, is the circumstance that he embodied and represented in his own person the tendency of the period, and revealed and developed those tendencies in his policy. It rarely happens that the most typical man of an age is selected by destiny to be a sovereign. It happened in the case of Hadrian, and his reign derives much of its peculiar interest from this coincidence. He was not a military monarch, and here, conspicuously, he was in touch with this age. The Roman world wanted peace and rest. Men did not yearn for conquest, and the military policy of Trajan, however plausible it may have seemed from a theoretical point of view, however necessary it may have been up to a certain point, was not in harmony with the spirit of his time. In this respect, Hadrian marked his position clearly at the outset. The first important act of his reign was the surrender of the 3 new eastern provinces, which Trajan had annexed: Armenia, Mesopotamia, and Assyria. The new emperor thus declared that he regarded Trajan's oriental expedition as a huge mistake, that he definitely abandoned the project of extending the empire eastward, and that he recurred to the policy of Augustus. He may be questioned whether it might not have been wiser to retain Armenia, while abandoning Mesopotamia and Assyria. Dislike of Trajan's war policy as a whole may have carried Hadrian too far in his reaction. It is even said that have he contemplated the surrender of Dacia, but if so, he was wise enough to abandon the idea. Dacia, in which a large number of Roman colonists had taken up their abode, was in quite a different position from the annexations beyond the Euphrates, where no Roman settlements had yet been made. Of resigning Arabia, Trajan's other new province, there was no question. This first act of Hadrian struck the keynote of his reign, and inaugurated that remarkable period of nearly half a century, in which the Roman world enjoyed a measure of peace and happiness, which it had never enjoyed before, and was never to enjoy again. The thought was beginning to force itself on people, more or less consciously, that men were not made for the state, but that the state was made for men. And Hadrian's policy expressed and realized this thought. Trajan's had been tempted to make the extension of the empire and military glory ends in themselves. Hadrian regarded the defense of the frontiers and the maintenance of the army merely as means to the prosperity of his subjects. He fully recognized the necessity of maintaining a strong military force, and of being prepared to fight in case of need, and he devoted himself to the reform of the military service, closely connected with this view of the state, and at the same time characteristic of his cosmopolitan temper was Hadrian's interest in the provinces. The importance of the welfare of the provinces had been recognized by Julius Caesar, and had been always a political principle under the empire. But Hadrian sympathized with the provincials more thoroughly than any of his predecessors, and really felt that the provinces were not made merely to serve home in Italy. He was himself less at home in Rome than in any part of his empire, and hardly a third part of his reign of 21 years was spent on Italian soil. He saw that personal acquaintance on the part of the ruler with the affairs of each province was requisite for a sound administration, and his journeys through the provinces are a unique and striking feature of his reign. His other great work was the creation of a civil service. He must not fail to note that in the period of peace and prosperity, which was inaugurated by Hadrian and continued by his 2 next successors, a great social and spiritual change of deep significance for the future of the empire, and also for the future of the world, was being accomplished. The process was reliant, and almost escapes our observation, but the results are clear. The principle of humanity, as opposed to Roman exclusiveness, was becoming widely recognized, and a spirit of cosmopolitanism was taking possession of the world. The way was being prepared for the diffusion of Christianity. This new spirit was injurious to the power of Rome, but advantageous for the future development of Europe. It helped on the decline of the empire, but it was also the beginning of the transformation of the ancient into the modern world. Hadrian is the first great representative of this new spirit. The last months of the year 117 A.D. were occupied with ordering the affairs of the East. The Parthian question was settled, as has been already said, by unveiling Trajan's conquests, abandoning the cause of Parthametis, and recognizing King Croesus. In order to retain the new conquests, it would have been necessary to increase the army and the financial condition of the empire. would not have admitted such a step without an increase of taxation. Moreover, under Trajan's military reign, too little attention had been paid to internal administration. These considerations alone were sufficient to move Hadrian to adopt a totally different policy from that of his predecessor. The danger of extending the frontier may have also been brought home to him by the reports which arrived of disturbances breaking out in remote corners of the realm. The Britons in the far north, the Sarmatians on the Danube, the Moors in the west, were all saving signs of rebellion, while the rising of the Jews in Palestine and Libya, not yet completely arrayed, was in itself an adverse comment on Oriental expeditions. Hadrian probably visited Palestine and Egypt himself to hasten the suppression of the Jewish revolt, which was carried out by his able officer Q. Martinus Turbo. He apologized Catilius Severus to the post of legatus of Syria, which he had occupied himself before his elevation to the Principate. He removed Lucius Quietus from the governorship of Judea, and sent him to his native land, Mauritania, apparently in order to quell a revolt which was breaking out among his countrymen. But Lucius, who was by no means well disposed to the new emperor, and disliked the change of policy, showed no energy in crushing the movement, or perhaps encouraged it. At all events, Hadrian found it necessary to send Turbo, who had already suppressed the Jews, to suppress the Moors also, and we are told that he disarmed Lucius Quietus. Hadrian travelled by way of Illyricum to Rome, which he reached early in 118 A.D. He was favorably received by the Senate, to which he now renewed in person the respectful overtures which he had already made by letter. The title Pater Patrix was offered to him, but he refused it, on the ground that Augustus had received it at a late period of his reign, and did not accept it until 128 A.D. He celebrated the Parthian triumph of Trajan, the image of the dead emperor being borne in the triumphal car. Hadrian was not long at Rome before he had to hurry away to the Danube to meet a Sarmatian invasion, and during his absence his throne was threatened by a conspiracy in which 4 men of great distinctly were implicated. The leader was a consular named Avitus Niginus, whom the empire seems to have regarded with special favor, and perhaps intended to choose as his successor in the Principate, besides another consular, Publius Celsus, 2 officers of high military reputation, Cornelius Palma, the conqueror of Arabi, and Lucius Quietus, who had already displayed a disloyal spirit in Mauretania, took part in the plot. The implication of these 2 generals suggests that dissatisfaction was felt in military circles at the peace policy of the new emperor. The intention of the conspirators was to kill Hadrian when he was either hunting or performing a sacrifice, be it in the plot, was discovered, and the Senate showed their zeal and loyalty by ordering the 4 conspirators to be put to death. When the news of the affair reached Hadrian, he placed the conduct of affairs on the Danube frontier in the hands of his trusted officer. Marcius Turbo had hastened back to Rome, August. He regretted the execution of the culprits, which was an unpopular act, and although the Senate had acted without consulting him, he was blamed for it, to dissipate the feelings of alarm which the occurrence had caused, and to show that terrorism was not to be the policy of his reign. He voluntarily took an oath never to pass sentence of death on a senator, as Trajan had done before him. During the next years, Hadrian seems to have devoted himself to internal reforms in Rome and Italy. In 119 A.D., he was consul for the 3rd and last time, and in the same year he undertook a journey through the southern Italy in 121 A.D., having laid the foundation stone of the Temple of Rome and Venus, April 21st. He started on his first great journey through the provinces, as he intended to be absent for a considerable time. It was necessary to leave the control of Rome in trustworthy hands. The safety of the city lay with the commanders of the Praetorian Guards. Hadrian had not full confidence in Attianus and Similis, the 2 prefects who were in office at his accession. Attianus had given him support at the critical moment, when his installation as princeps was doubtful, and on that account might have proved presumptuous, while Similis was a man of independent ideas. Accordingly they were removed, and Q. Marcius Turbo, along with C. Septicius Clarus, appointed in their stead. Hadrian undertook 2 great journeys through the provinces. The first began in spring 121 A.D. and ended with his return to Rome at the end of 126 A.D. The second began in spring 129 A.D. and ended with his return to Rome early in 134 A.D. On the first occasion he visited almost all the provinces of the empire, both western and eastern, but on the second occasion he only visited the eastern. This was probably due to the outbreak of the Jewish rebellion, which recalled him to Judea, as he was retracing his path to the west, 131 through 132 A.D., so that at this point his second long absence from home ceases to be a provincial tour. Besides these 2 great journeys, he undertook, in the interval between them, a lesser journey to the African provinces, 128 A.D. The exact route of his first journey is not in all respects certain, but it seems to have been as follows. Having made a progress through eastern Gaul, and probably visited Lugudunum, he proceeded to the province of Upper Germany, and thence along the northern frontier, and Rhaetia, and Noricum, into Pannonia, returning doubtless by a different route through these provinces. He reached the Rhine again, proceeded to Lower Germany, and passing through the Laurel of the Batavians, crossed over to Britain, 122 A.D. Having remained there for some months, he returned to Gaul and travelled through the western regions of that country to Spain, where he visited Tarraco. A revolt of the Moors induced him to visit Mauritania, though this perhaps was not part of his programme, and thence he went on to Africa, and possibly to Libya. Crossing over to Asia Minor, he first visited the cities on the coast, and then travelled through the interior to the Euphrates, 123 A.D. Returning by the coast of the Euxine, he traversed Pontus and Bithynia, and crossed over to Thrace, whence advancing through Macedonia, he received successively Epirus and Thessaly. In autumn 125 A.D. he arrived at Athens, where he spent the winter and spring, and made a tour in the Peloponnesus in the following summer, whence he returned to Rome, taking Sicily on the way, 126 A.D. His second journey began by a second visit to Athens, where he spent another winter, 129 through 130 A.D. Then he sailed to the south coast of Asia Minor, and landing in Syria or Lycia, travelled through Placidia and Cilicia into Syria, reaching Antioch by June. In the same summer he visited Palmyra, Judea, and Arabia, and proceeded in autumn to Egypt, where he spent the greater part of the year. Returning to the latter part of 131 A.D. to Syria, whence he set out for the west, Phi has been recalled by the Jewish revolt, and spent 2 years on the scene of warfare. These imperial visits may in some cases have been burdensome and expensive to the provincials at the time, but there can be no doubt that they conduced to the prosperity of the subject lands. The emperor saw with his own eyes the condition and needs of each province, and also the exact importance of each in relation to the rest of the empire. We cannot trace all that he did in the correction of abuses, or in furthering the economical interests of the land which he visited, but we know how he tried to secure the indispensable condition of peaceful development, namely, the satisfy of the emperor against invaders. Hadrian never lost sight of this end. His care in providing for it was exhibited in 2 ways. He introduced a number of vital reforms into the army and the military system. He developed, with more consistency than any emperor before him, the method of defending the frontiers by artificial means. The military reforms of Hadrian went into the minutest details, and he may be considered the originator of the military system of the later empire. His changes affected both tactics and discipline. His great reform in tactics was the introduction of the phalanx, not exactly the Macedonian phalanx, but an improved form. the necessity of superseding the old legionary battle array seems to have been proved in recent warfare. Hadrian directed all his officers to study carefully the tactics and MS of the barbarians, Parthians and Armenians in the rest, Sarmatians beyond the Danube, Celts and Britain. He also introduced oriental armor and heavily armed cavalry. His Batavian squadrons were so well drilled that they could swim across rivers in panoply. Improvements were made in the military engines with a view to facilitating the rapid motion of the army. Hadrian found that the discipline of the camp had degenerated, and he spent the greatest pains in restoring it, and made it stricter than ever. He increased the number of centurions, and only allowed those to be appointed who were of strong body and good character. He admitted none to the legionary tribunate who were not of mature age. Leaves of absence were rarely granted, and everything that could have an enervating effect on the soldiers was removed from the camps. But notwithstanding his strictness, he was very popular with the men, and there was not a mutiny throughout his peaceful reign. This was due to the fact that he shared with the soldiers their exercises and privations whenever he visited the camps, and required of them to undergo no hardships which he was not ready to undergo himself. His dress was severely simple. His repast consisted of the same plain food, lard, cheese, and sour wine as that of the legionaries themselves. On the march, he used to walk or ride in full armor and bareheaded amid the snows of Caledonia, or beneath the hot sun of Egypt, and never made use of the vehicle. He concerned himself with every detail of military life. He used to visit the ambulances every day, used to attend to the commissariat, and inspect the arms, dress, and baggage of the soldiers. On coins he is often represented as addressing his legions. At Lambasis in Africa, where he founded a new camp, of which the praetorium, or general's quarters, still stands, a pedestal has been found, on which is inscribed a speech, which he delivered to Legion III. Augusta. He praises the soldiers for their performance of the most difficult exercises, for executing in a single day works which would employ others for a week, for their sham battles and other achievements. Under no emperor was the army in more efficient condition than under Hadrian. In regard to the fleet, Hadrian introduced the regulation that all the marines should possess ius latinum. Thus no Roman citizen, whether Italian or provincial, could serve in the fleet. The service was only open to those who possessed Latin rights, or those who possessed neither Roman nor Latin rights. The latter received iva latinum on entering the service. End of chapter 26, sections 1 and 2. Recording by Chris Caron, Ham Lake, Minnesota.